This is the 5-minute guide to the ARA General Belgrano of the Argentine Navy. The General Belgrano began life as the Brooklyn-class light cruiser USS Phoenix, whose career and specifications are covered in the video we have published on that class. Along with the USS Bohais, the ship was sold to Argentina in the early 1950s. The Bohais was renamed to the 9th of July, the date of Argentina independence. The Phoenix was renamed to the 17th of October, the so-called People's Loyalty Day. Both ships were involved in a coup in 1955 in which the president was overthrown. Shortly after this, the ship was renamed as the General Belgrano, after an officer who had fought for Argentine independence in the 19th century, and founded a school of navigation before also effectively founding the Argentine Navy. In so doing, she became the second ship to have this name, taking the place of a 19th century armored cruiser that had been in service for about 50 years, and had only been scrapped a few years previously. The next year, 1956, she was accidentally rammed by her sister ship whilst on exercises, and was docked for repairs. In the next decade, as technology advanced, it became clear that the ship's 40mm anti-aircraft guns were unlikely to be able to protect her against aerial threats in any kind of serious conflict. And since both Chile and Brazil were modernizing their own armed forces, the Belgrano was due for an upgrade. Therefore, some of the anti-aircraft armament was removed in favor of the SeaCAD missile system, the world's first short-range point defense missile to reach operational status, and one designed to be able to replace the 40mm installation without much modification to the ship in question. Ironically, as it would later turn out, the system was British, but for the moment it offered protection against close-range attacks by subsonic jets, large cruise missiles, and also against small ships and attack craft. The refit needed to add a pair of these launchers to the ship was completed by 1968. After that, the ship's career appears to have been relatively quiet, consisting largely of training cruises and patrols of various territories Argentina actually owned, and few that she claimed, but did not control. In the meantime, Argentina went back and forth politically between a military dictatorship, then bringing the old president back, then his wife taking over when he died, then back to a military dictatorship. During this second round of military rule, the economy declined rapidly, and the general in charge decided the best way to distract and unite the people was to have a war. Since it was not supposed to be a proper war, where you might actually lose a lot of people, he could not go to war with Chile, which might well have won, but in the early 1980s he thought instead that taking the nearby Falkland Islands away from Britain might do the trick. The Argentines had claimed the islands for decades, and the Americans had so far backed Argentina's actions in general in order to keep left-wing political parties from gaining a foothold in that part of South America. Therefore, in 1982 Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, when Britain did the unexpected and vowed to fight to take them back. The Argentine Navy was dispatched to stop them. This was primarily the job of a pair of task forces. In the north, the aircraft carrier 25th of May, ironically the ex-British HMS Venerable, alongside two Type 42 destroyers, also amusingly British designed, sailed with 3 French designed corvettes, which were perhaps a more appropriate enemy force for the Royal Navy. In the south, 2 ex-American Sumner-class destroyers accompanied the Belgrano. Both sets of ships were skirting the edge of the 200-mile radius total exclusion zone around the Falklands, an area in which the British had said any ship not belonging to them was liable to be sunk without warning. But on the 30th of April, the Belgrano and her escorts were detected by the nuclear-powered submarine HMS Conqueror, which started to follow them. The next day, all Argentine naval vessels were ordered to find and attack the British task force, presumably with the Belgrano approaching the task force whilst it was distracted by air attack from the north, and using its superior gun-based firepower to sink enemy ships, but this message was intercepted by the British. As a result, on the 2nd of May 1982, the Conqueror fired 3 torpedoes at the Belgrano. Interestingly, although she was equipped with modern Tigerfish homing torpedoes, there were issues with this weapon's reliability. So instead, 3 Mark 8 torpedoes, straight-running weapons from the Second World War about as old as the Belgrano herself, were used. Of the 3 fired, a pair hit the ship. The first blew off the front of the ship, but the bulkheads held. The second blew a massive hole in the ship just after the back end of the armor plating, and knocked out all electrical power. Within minutes it was clear the ship was doomed. In the darkness, the ship's escorts somehow missed the Belgrano being hit, and one of them was even hit by the third torpedo, but because this was at the end of its run it did not detonate. Eventually they realized what had happened and turned back, but as a result of the delay and bad weather a total of 323 of those aboard lost their lives, about 275 in the torpedo explosions and roughly 50 to the weather afterwards. 772 men including the captain were rescued. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. You might also notice I'm still talking. If you wanted to know the history of the ship then you can leave now. If you want to learn a bit more about the circumstances of the sinking, please keep watching. Okay. The sinking of the Belgrano has generated quite a bit of controversy over the years. At the time, element of the British Labour Party and some of the Argentine government claimed the attack was illegitimate. Obviously the Royal Navy and the British government claimed it was legal. But what is the true answer? First, we must dismiss the ideas of the Labour Party. They were the minority opposition, and therefore were especially biased in trying to find any fault with the British government of the time, who until the war started, had looked likely to lose the next election. Likewise, we can safely ignore the Argentine government of the time. This might seem harsh, but in their statement the day after the sinking they claimed amongst other things, that Argentina was adhering to the United Nations advocated ceasefire, when in fact they had instructed all naval units to attack the British task force 3 days before, and had not rescinded that order at the time of the sinking. So they are obviously unreliable. For fairness, and because nobody truly trusts politicians, we must also dismiss the statements and claims of the British government of the time as well, since although they made the decision, and sought out advice beforehand, if they had made a mistake they are not likely to admit it afterwards. Instead we will look at 3 points of view, that of the respective navies and that of the pure legal standpoint. The main arguments put forward claiming the sinking was not legitimate are, that the ship was outside the exclusion zone, and therefore could not be attacked, that the ship was sailing away from the task force, and therefore was not a threat, and should not have been attacked, and finally that a peace plan proposed by Peru had arrived, and that any hostility should have been avoided until that plan was discussed and addressed. The last point is the most easily addressed. Whilst it is true that the plan was sent to Britain about half a day before the torpedoes were fired, records indicate that no relevant member of the British government actually saw the plan until after the ship had been sunk. With regards to the other issues, starting with the legal perspective, the Belgrano was outside of the 200-mile radius exclusion zone the British had established. However, in a message passed to the Argentine government over a week before the sinking the British made it clear that the exclusion zone was an area in which any ship was liable to attack, but also specified that any Argentine ship or aircraft considered hostile or a threat would be engaged wherever they were found, not just in the exclusion zone. Since such zones are not mandatory in war, the British were free to do this, and indeed the normal rules of war allow for enemy craft to be engaged anywhere on the high seas. That this was understood on both sides is proven by the Argentine admiral in charge of the Belgrano's task force, who stated, after that message of the 23rd of April, the entire South Atlantic was an operational theater for both sides. We, as professionals, said it was just too bad that we lost the Belgrano. From the British naval perspective, to answer the claim that the ship was sailing away, the answer of the British admiral in charge of the Royal Navy forces in the area stated the somewhat obvious: the speed and direction of an enemy ship can be irrelevant, because both can change quickly. What counts is his position, his capability and what I believe to be his intention. This can be seen in many naval actions. For example, when it was caught the Bismarck was heading for France, not a convoy. The Roma was heading for Malta, not Germany, and the Musashi was heading north away from American forces when it was sunk. However, nobody suggests that simply because these ships were heading away from their immediate enemies, that they therefore were not a threat and a legitimate target. Now, you might expect that from a legal and a British perspective, and plenty of media reports have been made about the supposed position of Argentina and so-called veterans of the ship or the war, despite many of these supposed veterans not actually being old enough to even have been born in 1982. Regardless of those, let us look at the opinions of Argentine naval officers. As we have already seen, the admiral in charge of the task force Belgrano was part of appears to accept the action as legitimate. In 1994 the Argentine Defense Ministry released a report which described the sinking of General Belgrano as a legal act of war, explaining that acts of war can be carried out in all of the enemy's territory and they can also take place in those areas over which no state can claim sovereignty, in international waters. Further, the head of the Argentine Navy in the 1990s wrote that General Belgrano was part of an operation that posed a real threat to the British task force, but was holding off for tactical reasons. He added that to leave the exclusion zone was not to leave the combat zone, to enter a protected area. He then explicitly stated that the sinking was not a war crime, but a combat action. Finally, the captain of the Belgrano himself published a book in 1992 in which he wrote that it is improper to accept that the attack by HMS Conqueror was a betrayal. During an interview in 2003 he said that General Belgrano was only temporarily sailing to the west at the time of the attack, and his orders were to attack any British ships which came within range of the cruiser's armament. Therefore, it can be concluded that from the point of view of the officers in both navies, and from a legal perspective, the sinking of the Belgrano was a legitimate act of war. Unfortunately for the memory of the brave men who died aboard her, their deaths have since been used by politicians to try and further other agendas. But that is why this channel is about warships, not politics.